This episode of Tutia Bruja is sponsored by Flood Witch, dedicated to providing information that helps you build an ethical witchcraft practice by raising marginalized voices while reclaiming weird. This is Flood Witch. Check it out at floodwitch.com.
I can see you clearly. Tutia Bruja.
What's up, witchy people? You're listening to another episode of Tutia Bruja. This is episode 12. So I'm really excited for this episode because a theme that has been going on throughout the show is how important it is to know your history. Our power lies within knowing what our ancestors had to go through, and what they had to overcome to get us to where we're at. Living in the US, it's really hard to be any type of person of color because, we spend so much time discussing the founding fathers. We spend so much time discussing the structures of government. So with this episode, I wanted to bring on a historian. Her name is Toya Coleman. She goes by Toya. Toya created an online virtual community that highlights Black-owned businesses and historic places in Harlem, and grew up in Harlem, lived in Harlem, has a lot of a background and knowledge of the area. Really wanted to have her on to have a discussion about the Harlem Renaissance, because the Harlem Renaissance is an amazing time for Black creators. There's all types of witches, and I think that there's also people who are art witches. They're able to create forms of art that really connect and help soothe, communicate things that the world needs to know. The Harlem Renaissance was such a magical time. So much art was created, music, literature, fashion was created that really just set this time period apart. It's kind of funny because I think we do see a lot of parallels kind of with what's going on now in the world and what was happening around that time period. That's kind of interesting. History does repeat itself. With this episode, I really just wanted to take the time to do more research about Zora, Neale, Hurston, and Langston Hughes. When we recorded, we had our discussion, and I had just started to find some text that Zora had written, and it was just really interesting because obviously your girl's a bruja, you know what I mean? Like, I'm a witch. Whenever I find out information about historic figures that are connected to witchcraft, it's always just like an aha moment. There was something that when I heard Toya in a previous podcast episode discuss the Harlem Renaissance, there was something within me that was just like sparked because I needed to find out that Zora Neale Hurston was a witch. I started to get really interested in Hoodoo and voodoo and went through a lot of practices and was accepted into the community. Hoodoo used to be a very closed practice. It was very closed. And when Zora did this, I really think that at first it came from a journalistic curiosity. And it seems like the more that she went in and partook in a lot of the customs, a lot of the rituals, she really just couldn't get enough. That was really interesting to read. All of this is to say, I'm going to include some links in the show notes of the things that I've been reading. Let's get into the episode, my conversation with Toya Coleman. Thank you for joining us for an episode of Tutia Bruja.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
You were on an episode of Balanced Black Girl, and I really loved your conversation because, I think a big part of witchcraft and spirituality is, really just knowing your power. Living in the US, any type of person of color has a hard time connecting to their roots just because we spent 12 years talking about the founding fathers.
I really enjoyed that conversation with Les. It was like the Black History Month episode and just talking about, things that are not, like you were talking about, that are not talked about, and especially when you're trying to condense it into 30 days.
Yeah. And we gain our strength from our ancestors, and all of the things that they were able to accomplish. And how do you realize your own strength if you don't know the history of the people that came before you?
That is a great question. Yeah. And that's a lot of what I do with like my own platform and my recent podcast that wasn't in my textbook. It's about kind of empowering people of color by giving them knowledge about their history, and particularly outside of just being enslaved, talking about the things both traumatic and celebratory that help you understand who you are, where you come from, so you can have a better understanding of yourself.
There's a time in history that I find fascinating that you do as well. The Harlem Renaissance made the 20s roar, and nobody really ever talks about all the influential Black creators that were doing amazing things during that time.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And being like a Harlem native, like born and raised there, I feel like people from Harlem may know about it, may not know, depending on, your educational background and where you went to school. Because like you said, founding fathers is like the thing to learn. But yeah, I think it's a pivotal moment in history that's super overlooked.
What do you feel for most people is the biggest takeaway from this time?
Wow, that's a hard question. I think the biggest takeaway is that it was the first time in history that Black people could really form an identity, because prior to that, it was like slavery, like being enslaved, being oppressed, and so we were not allowed to read and write. We weren't allowed to paint or draw or make music. And so we were really suppressed as a people. So it was the first time that, we were able to kind of form an identity outside of being taken from Africa and enslaved and held in bondage. So I think that's like the biggest takeaway, is that it was a real big moment for Black identity. And it was a major time where Black identity was formed, and so much of America's identity was formed from what came out of the Harlem Renaissance.
Like you said, it's this big pivotal time. It's only kind of mentioned in your history class, maybe, if the Roaring Twenties are discussed at all. But I think I learned the most about the Harlem Renaissance definitely in my English class.
Oh.
In high school, I read Their Eyes Were Watching God, which is a book by Zora, Neale, Hurston. And I also read a collection of Langston Hughes poems, and they were so influential for this time period and for each other too. Harlem, I've never been. From what I've seen, it's not a huge area. So it's like everybody during this time was kind of amongst other creative people. It was like this utopia of just all these amazing creative people having the opportunity to influence each other and work with each other, to kind of reflect on that time and all the inspiration that these people gave each other just by like hanging out.
Mm-hmm.
Makes it so much more interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I think I looked it up today. It's like, they say it's like almost like the length of it of Harlem, because Harlem is a smaller neighborhood in Manhattan. So it's about like 3 miles. Like you can walk Harlem, you know what I mean? Like I grew up there, but like if it's a nice day, if it's summertime, it's not too hot, of course, you can really like walk, you run into people. It's like a very small neighborhood. So I can only imagine what it was like back then with all these like pivotal artists and friends. Like sometimes it reminds me of like a college campus. Like if you're from Harlem and you know people and you walk around, like I literally would run into my elementary school principal. Like she lived in Harlem, my school was in Harlem. So it's very like small knit, I think, because of gentrification that has changed. But growing up there, in the 90s and early 2000s, it very much felt like a very intimate Black space.
See, that's amazing. Checking out your podcast today, you were very lucky to have the opportunity to go to a school where like you learned very early on about all these people who contributed to Black culture. You had a very unique experience that I think also has shaped who you are today.
Yeah, very much. And I feel like I didn't realize I had that unique experience until I was like entered into white spaces. Like once I started going to high school, I went to boarding school, and then I went away to college. I was like, oh, not all Black people don't grow up in a Black neighborhood and go to Black schools and have Black teachers. That's rare. I mean, I guess that could be my ignorance. Like I didn't really appreciate that or realize how rare it was until like later on in life. But it very much has shaped who I am. That's why I have my platform, which is really focused on, amplifying Black voices, Black owned businesses. And that's why, I started my podcast about like unknown history, because, those schools and those founders, they created safe spaces for Black students so that they would learn about themselves outside of February. And my elementary school teacher literally started her school because she was homeschooling her kids, because she like went around to different public schools and she wasn't happy with like the curriculum. And she was like, I'm gonna just teach my own kids. And then people started dropping off their kids at her house. And she opened up a Montessori school. It was still relatively small. There was like 20, maybe 25, students in my elementary school. And it was like very community. Like we all had to bring our own lunches, and she had like a space in like a school. So it was very intimate and empowering and inspiring. And I think that's why like I do what I do, because those people who started like my elementary and middle school were really just like paying it forward and trying to create safe spaces. And it's like something that I want to do like, digitally, I guess, at this point.
You went to school in Harlem, you lived in Harlem, you were able to see how the area like reflected the times and the changes. For me, I didn't learn about Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston until high school. When were you aware of them as figures in history? Was it earlier on?
Yeah, elementary school in Harlem, they have the County Cullen Museum Library. They have the Schomburg, which are Black libraries. So that was like my first introduction to a library. Like we had a librarian give us a tour, teach us how to research, and we had to memorize a Langston Hughes poem for like our winter formal. So that was very much like early on for me in elementary school. And being in Harlem, that was a lesson that we had about like how did Harlem form and all that other stuff.
Who do you connect more with, Zora Neale Hurston or Langston Hughes?
Wow, those are some good idols. I don't even know. I feel like I know more about Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, especially towards the end of her life and being from the South. And Langston Hughes is not from the South. I forgot exactly where he's from, but I know Zora's from like Florida. So I guess I would say by default Langston Hughes, but they're both great icons and they both have made contributions to our literature that still exist. But I guess I would say Langston Hughes, although I'm not a poet. So I love Zora's writing. That's a hard question.
And not that you can't appreciate both. A lot of Zora Neale Hurston's work, she did a lot of research, which I have found interesting. I recently found a bunch of articles that she wrote about Hoodoo, which I think is really cool because I didn't know that previously. And I love witchy stuff. So I'm just like, Zora, were you a witch? And honestly, I wouldn't be surprised because like, I feel like sometimes I just feel more connected to certain individuals because I'm like, there's something about you that was witchy. I feel it.
I feel like, our ancestors were much more in tune with spirits and spirituality. And I think that there's something, there's like a essence that they had about them. And, they were more connected to dreams and stuff like that. I don't know if it's like westernization and all that other stuff has kind of erased in some ways some of that, which is very much a part of the culture for many people of color, not just like Black people, like indigenous people and stuff like that. But I think colonialism is like, oh no, you're crazy. We have to talk about traditional white religions and, spirituality and witchcraft or whatever you want to call it is something that's very much a part of our culture. And I feel like was looked at as crazy, by colonizers and like, you can't practice this. So a lot of things were done in secrecy, but then also a lot of things were lost in like, generations.
Like you said, a lot of people had to figure out ways to practice in secret because it was a way to protect themselves and still keep those old traditions. So like colonizers wouldn't bother them. I don't know. It's interesting how all of our ancestors, people of color, really have survived so much. And again, if you don't know your history, it's hard to connect to that power and like, oh, look at all the things that the people that came before me did and accomplished to get me to where I'm at. Oh, Langston Hughes was from Missouri.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is funny because I'm from here. Like we would have like a larger connection. But I want to say he grew up in Joplin and then moved out east.
Because I remember some of the stuff that I read about the connection, the friendship between Langston Hughes and Zora was that like, she was like the Southern person and was able to kind of like, at one point they like kind of did a little tour together of the South and she was kind of like the guide for that. So kind of went on a tour together because she was doing research and he was doing lectures and they kind of just was like, oh, we should hang out. And she kind of took him through the South because he was like, I don't really know where I'm going. So the Midwest and the South have similarities, but they also have differences.
That album, Country Grammar by Neale, really kind of summarizes it for me.
A classic.
The city and the country. It's interesting because Josephine Baker was from the St. Louis area and she also moved to Harlem, but I guess she technically left before the supposed dates of like the Harlem Renaissance, but she definitely had an influence.
Yeah, and I believe she like did tours and traveled, so I'm sure she probably wasn't like based in Harlem, but was a frequent visitor.
She went to Paris. She brought some influence with her and definitely caught the eye of so many different individuals.
Yeah, and a lot of people from Harlem Renaissance spent some time in Paris, which is really interesting because they felt like at the time Paris was a little bit more progressive. Because I think James Baldwin was there for a little while. I think Langston Hughes also was in Paris. So I think Paris and Harlem had like a very unique relationship that people don't really talk about. But I've heard a lot about people kind of going in between those two places.
It does make sense because since it was more progressive for Black individuals, it was easier for them to go and create and not have to deal with American racism.
Exactly.
They don't really talk about the fashion as much. That's the big reason you see a lot of boas and thin eyebrows in the 20s, because that kind of originated with Black performers.
Yeah, I mean, I love the fashion, and I feel like, with the way that things are set up, fashion always kind of like comes back, and so it gets recycled. So I feel like a lot of the things in the Harlem Renaissance have come back, like flappers and fringe. Like fringe, people love fringe on their jackets, you know what I'm saying, on their skirts. And then I really used to like I think they call them like the cloche hats. They're like kind of like those tight round hats that cover your hair, and it's supposed to be like a bell, because like the French word is belle, which I thought was interesting because some of the like words and fashion words are kind of from Paris, and we just made that connection of like Paris and Harlem Renaissance. But I used to really like that. I actually like bought one a couple of years ago. I don't know. I actually borrowed it. I was like doing a styling thing and I took some pictures in it for one of my like Throwback Thursday posts. And I just really love those. Like it's so nice. And I think the Harlem Renaissance was one of the first periods where it was kind of like they had more masculine silhouettes for women as well. And that was a thing. And that's also something that is part of our current day fashion that I don't think is going anywhere. Like a lot of classic looks stem from that period, but people don't like make that connection.
And it's like you said, it's the recycling of fashion. And it's not like everybody can't appreciate it. The Chola look is dope, but thin eyebrows started in the 20s. I just really love giving credit where credit is due. And I don't feel like people always do that.
Yeah, I think part of it is like ignorance and also just not looking into it, because I don't think people even realize it. Because like, we were just talking about Josephine Baker. Yeah, and she's like a fashion icon.
Sometimes to look through the lens of why people did things, to even understand it's like you had to have been there, I feel.
Which is like, what if we could go back to a time period? I definitely would go back to Harlem Renaissance. Like if I could go back into a historical time.
Without a doubt, because I love music too. And that was such a huge time for music. Someone once told me that the Harlem Renaissance was Black people's classical music. And I was like, I mean, it's not wrong.
One of the places that jazz was born, which is an American staple. It's a Black American staple, but it's become like American staple. You know what I mean?
Yeah. The way that the musicians played was altered by the fact that they were smoking cannabis. Watch this documentary. And I mean, like, it obviously makes sense. It allowed them to play quicker or play, I guess, more focused. I know that Louis Armstrong loved his weed.
Well, I think for a long time, there's been like a relationship with like drugs and music and artistry in general, right? There's always some correlation. It helps, I think a lot of different artists have said like, it helps them be creative and all that other stuff. And I also believe, like, I was just trying to look up, when was marijuana illegal? And it was kind of like not until like the 1930s, like, so at the beginning of Harlem Renaissance, which is like, they say 1910, like weed and marijuana was not illegal. So I wouldn't be surprised at all that people were doing it. And a text that I read was talking about how they used to have these like teapot rooms or tea pads, and they would be like rooms or an apartment in which people would like gather and smoke. And it was just like a part of like the process, kind of like after party kind of thing or pre-party. And again, like I don't think it was like fully illegal at the time. So I wouldn't be surprised at all. I mean, I enjoy weed, so.
Same here. So Henry Ford didn't want the spread of jazz because jazz, in his opinion, attracted Black individuals, Jewish people, and Mexican people.
No people of color, no immigrants.
If you look up most states, the state dance is square dance. And that's like an intentional thing. It was because they were trying to eliminate the spread of jazz because people of color were smoking marijuana. That was common in places where jazz would play. So they were trying to eliminate the spread of them hanging out with their white women. Henry Ford was like a big spearhead of that. And then, what's his name? Harry J. Anslinger really didn't like Black people. So I know that he targeted them a lot, and he's responsible for Billie Holiday's death, which is really dark. But I know that that was the big reason that he was pushing a lot of propaganda. Yeah, it's really fucked. And especially now when you think about the fact cannabis is, legal in certain spots. Think about how 100 years later, you can go in Denver or LA or like specific places and go and pick up your product and leave. How a lot of things can change in 100 years.
Yeah, and also just outside of just that, it's like there is medicinal and like so many other properties to weed outside of like THC that has been proven scientifically to help people with stroke and anxiety and all this other stuff. And like for years, because it was so deeply rooted in racism and capitalism, the government wanted to figure out how they could capitalize on it. You know what I mean? That we're withholding also like health and things like that can help people because of, I don't know, racism? Like, that's ridiculous.
It's an ancestral plant. Like, you know what I mean? There was a history of Black people and there was a history of Mexican people consuming it, and it was enjoyed. And it was a way to stomp that out. And I'm just like, why can't people just let people live? The specific quote by Louis Armstrong: "All I want is a permit to carry that good shit. You must see it to it that I get a special permit to smoke all the reefers I want to, when I want, or I'm just going to have to put down this horn. I can't afford to be tense, fearing that at any moment I could be arrested and be brought to jail." The man just wanted to play music and smoke weed. Like, why was that such a big deal?
Wow. You know why it's such a big deal. He's middle class and he's talented. You know what I mean? He was a little too much.
They just couldn't handle him. He was just too cool.
Mm-hmm.
Everything that's come after it, you can still look into the history. I didn't know that Zora Neale Hurston like wrote a bunch of research on Hoodoo. What am I doing now? Reading it.
Yeah, I was like, ooh, Hoodoo, what is that? I've heard of voodoo. And then like understanding the distinctions between the two, which is like Hoodoo is supposed to be like based in African and like root doctors and healers, and voodoo is born in Haiti and considered more of a religion. So it's like you learn so much from just learning about the different things that you're doing. And she was very much also like a researcher and a scholar. I think a lot of people focus on her writing, which is great. And they recently, I think it was this last year, they released another book of short essays by her that is, a lot of them are based in Harlem because historically speaking, a lot of her writing was based in, her town, Florida, like Eatonville, Florida. And so this new collection is a lot of stories that are based in her Harlem Renaissance experience. So that might be something that somebody wants to check out. And they're like really fun. And some of them are funny. Some of them are sad, but it's called Hitting a Straight Lick with a Crooked Stick, which I can't say 3 times in a row, but it's a really good collection of stories. And it was the first time I think she really wrote about like Harlem and her life and experience like on the East Coast during that time period.
Ooh, I'm going to attach the link to that in the show notes because I'm really curious about it. There's so much that isn't known about her.
Yeah. And her ending of her life is very mysterious and kind of sad. And, I believe it was Toni Morrison that really started researching her and like, helped with bringing her work to light and publishing her work, before Toni Morrison passed. But she really helped catapult Zora's story and her work. I think even the understanding that Toni Morrison went and searched Zora Neale Hurston's work and helped her stuff start being reprinted and everything like that after she passed also shows like the importance of, as people of color, we need to support each other, represent each other, and amplify each other's voices, especially once you become person in power and you can leverage that to like help each other out. And I think that was like a great example of like another Black writer who clearly was influenced and impacted by Zora Neale Hurston, who was like, no, I'm going to find her work. I'm going to help it be republished, get this in print. I just think that story is like very beautiful.
That is very beautiful. I want my best friend to be a ghost. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like her work really had to just speak in a way, just like, I got you. I'm going to make sure everyone sees it. Well, Toya, thank you so much for coming on the show. Where can everyone find you and support you?
Thank you so much for having me. I had a great time. You can find me on my personal Instagram is Toya from Harlem, and that's everywhere on the interwebs, even Pinterest, YouTube. That's my personal Toya from Harlem, and I have a website where I amplify Black businesses and voices. I do Black-owned businesses of the week on my Instagram, which is really cool. And then I recently started my own podcast that wasn't in my textbook, which is on all streaming platforms, which is just bi-weekly dosages on the history of things you always wish you learned from that boring, bulky textbook. So far, like I launched on Juneteenth. So we've covered like the history of Juneteenth, 6 mind-blowing facts you should know. And then I also recently did a July 4th episode of, when Black folks celebrated July 4th, because believe it or not, July 4th used to be a Black holiday. And so it's just my way of uncovering history that's not in our textbooks. And some of it will be like based in some things we've learned and like demystifying those things and uncovering the truth. And then some things will just be fun. Like, I have some really fun episodes on like the history of sex and the history of tea. So it's not just all traditional textbooks. It's out of the textbook topics. So those are the 2 places you can find me.
I will include all that information in the show notes. Check out the podcast, everyone. It's really good. The episodes so far have been you can binge them all probably within an hour and a half.
Yeah, they're short little sound bites.
Support. All right, so that was the episode. So I really hope that you enjoyed it. Honestly, I really love talking history with people. It's so much more interesting when you go to a space and you see the layout of the town, the city, the streets, the people, this conversation was really wonderful because as a Harlem native, Toya was able to really help us have a little bit more of an understanding of what it's like to live there and what it must have been like for these cultural figures during this influential and revolutionary time. So all the links to support Toya are in the show notes. I've included some witchy materials in regards to Zora Neale Hurston, like I said. Have a great rest of your day. And I just really hope wherever in the world you are, that you are healing from whatever is really hurting your soul. I care about you. I love you. Have a good one. Bye.
I can see